Hey everyone, you think Russia's Plan B is just a backup plan for when a quick victory doesn't happen? Wrong. Plan B is an attrition formula. Hit the power grid, weaponize winter, and bet on Western fatigue so Ukraine bends without a single decisive battle. But there's a problem nobody wants to say out loud. The pain is real. The outages are real, the casualties are real, yet the breakpoint this strategy needs still hasn't arrived, and because Ukraine isn't collapsing loudly, the failure is happening quietly, right in front of us. The coldest part of this story isn't the weather, it's the logic in an attrition war. It's not who shoots more that wins, it's who can endure longer without cracking politically. That's why the strikes don't just target military sites. They target the rhythm of civilian life: electricity, heating, repair crews, daily routines. The aim isn't only to destroy, it's to keep life permanently unstable, and when life is unstable long enough, a society starts negotiating with itself before it negotiates with the enemy. What people miss is that Russia doesn't need a nationwide blackout to make this work. It needs frequent disruptions that make every normal day feel temporary. If you can make a major city wonder every evening whether the lights will stay on tonight, you've already shifted the center of gravity. You try to think about this. The goal isn't darkness, it's doubt. Doubt spreads faster than propaganda because it feels like common sense when the power keeps blinking, and once doubt takes root, it becomes political pressure on leaders, on allies, on the entire support coalition. Here's where the mechanism gets sharper. Plan B has 3 pillars, and they stack on top of each other like weight plates. First, winterization, turning basic services into a political stress test by repeatedly damaging power and heat. Second, social exhaustion, forcing people to live in a constant on and off cycle that drains productivity and makes organizing harder. Third, Western fatigue, dragging the timeline out until support turns from moral imperative into budget line item. Russia doesn't have to convince everyone. It only has to wait for enough cracks. And there's a reason drones matter so much in this plan. Drones are cheap enough to use often, and frequent attacks are the whole point. Even when defenses work, the alerts still wake people up, the repairs still cost money, and the uncertainty still accumulates. A swarm doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be relentless. If you can force air defenses to fire repeatedly and force cities to repair repeatedly, you're not just striking infrastructure, you're taxing attention, time, and morale. Now zoom in on the grid itself, because this is the lever most people misunderstand. You don't have to turn off every light to cripple a city. You hit key nodes, substations, transmission lines, transformer points, places where one break cascades into many failures. That's why one successful strike can ripple across neighborhoods that were never directly targeted. It's the difference between breaking a lamp and cutting the circuit, and the more a defender has to rebuild that circuit, the more the defender is forced into a race of replacement parts, not just battlefield tactics. This is also why the strikes are timed the way they are. A hit during mild weather is a disruption. A hit during a hard freeze is a crisis multiplier. Cold changes the math of everything: hospital capacity, logistics, water pumping, shelter, communication. It makes every outage feel personal, not abstract, and it quietly turns civilians into the battlefield, because the battlefield becomes daily life. That's not just cruelty, it's strategy. Here is the mini reveal that should make you uneasy. If Plan B only works when the tempo keeps rising, then Plan B is fragile by design. An attrition formula that requires constant escalation is admitting it can't generate a decisive political outcome at a steady state. It's like a machine that only runs if you keep flooring the gas pedal. The moment the pace slows because of interception rates, supply constraints, or political limits, the pressure drops. And when pressure drops, the whole theory of the breakpoint starts wobbling. Let me say one thing clearly, because this conflict is not a single variable equation. War outcomes are multi-causal, and both sides adapt, miscalculate, and change incentives over time, so any one tactic decides everything take is usually a trap. With that said, the logic of Plan B is still readable, and we can still test it against results. The test is simple. Does the pressure convert into surrender signals, fractures in leadership, or a collapse in Allied support? And so far, the conversion rate looks bad, because endurance is not passive. Ukraine adapts. Repair networks get faster, redundancy gets smarter, air defenses adjust, and the population learns grim routines that make shock harder to achieve. You can see it in the way cities recover. The faster the restoration, the smaller the political payoff of the strike. Russia can increase pain, but pain is not the same as breakpoint. You try to think about this. If a society can absorb a hit, repair, and still function, then each repeat attack teaches resilience instead of surrender. There's also a second battlefield running underneath the explosions: production. This is a manufacturing war disguised as a drone war. The side that can scale output drones, interceptors, parts, generators slowly bends the other side's options. And that's why the scariest sentence in this whole story is not new weapon, it's higher volume. Volume is what keeps the pressure campaign alive, and volume is what can quietly flip the advantage in a long timeline. One quick piece of grounded advice, because it helps you stay sane in information warfare. When you see dramatic claims about imminent collapse, look for 3 checks: sustained effect over weeks, measurable recovery times, and credible confirmation from multiple independent sources, not viral clips alone. That habit protects your judgment. So where does that leave Plan B right now? It's causing real suffering, and it can still create tactical advantages, but it hasn't produced the strategic outcome it's designed for. If anything, it's forcing the war into a contest of endurance and output, where the defender's adaptation matters more each month. And that's why the failure can be silent. The strikes keep coming, the headlines keep sounding catastrophic, yet the political snap never happens. The scary part is that silence can be misread as inevitability. In the next part, I am going to show you the 4 signs that Plan B is missing its target even while it looks terrifying on the surface. And then we'll go one layer deeper: how negotiations get pulled into this pressure campaign, and why security guarantees become the most dangerous phrase on the table. Because once Plan B can't force a breakpoint, Russia's next move is to redefine what breaking even means, and that's the twist most people don't see coming. If Plan B were working, you wouldn't need to argue about it. You'd see the breakpoint show up in behavior: panic buying, mass flight, political fractures, commanders begging for pauses, allies hesitating in public. Instead, what we're watching is something colder and quieter: damage without surrender. Cities go dark, repairs happen, life limps forward, and the next wave arrives. Russia can prove it can hurt Ukraine, but hurting someone is not the same thing as forcing them to fold. The first sign of silent failure is the simplest one: the moment never arrives. A pressure campaign is supposed to convert pain into a decision, not just pain into more pain. Kharkiv losing power in deep winter is exactly the kind of headline Plan B is built for, and yet the strategic picture doesn't snap. The system bends, then stiffens. The strikes keep coming, but the political outcome stays out of reach. The second sign is adaptation, and it's the enemy of shock. A grid can be damaged, but it can also be rerouted, patched, stabilized, and defended in smarter ways over time. The more often a defender repairs under fire, the more it learns where the true weak points are. That learning curve is slow, but it's real, and it quietly steals value from every repeated strike. I keep coming back to one brutal truth: an attrition strategy loses its magic the moment the target stops being surprised. The third sign is that the campaign starts to look like a treadmill. If Russia has to increase tempo to keep the same level of fear, that's not dominance, that's dependency. Drones are cheap compared to missiles, sure, but cheap doesn't mean infinite, and volume is still a supply chain problem. Every wave demands parts, launch crews, navigation components, production capacity, and time. And when the whole plan relies on relentless repetition, any bottleneck becomes a strategic fracture line. Just think about this for a second. If the attacker needs constant escalation to keep morale pressure stable, who is actually being exhausted first? The people without power, or the system that has to manufacture the pressure day after day without a decisive payoff? That question matters because it flips the narrative from inevitable collapse to sustained cost with uncertain return. Plan B looks scary in snapshots, but strategy lives in timelines, and in a timeline, the side that can standardize, scale, and endure often wins the quiet war underneath the loud one. The fourth sign is outside the battlefield. The coalition doesn't crack the way Plan B needs it to. Western fatigue is real as a risk, but risk isn't the same as outcome. If support truly collapses, you don't see steady signals and incremental packages. You see delays, public splits, and leaders protecting themselves politically. Instead, you keep seeing a stubborn baseline message: this can't be allowed to become normal. Plan B is designed to make normal feel too expensive, but the West hasn't fully accepted that price tag as inevitable. And then there's the twist: when Plan B can't deliver a breakpoint on the ground, it tries to manufacture one at the table. Pressure campaigns don't just punish. They reframe negotiations. They push the defender toward deals that would be unthinkable during calm weather, because the public mood changes when daily life becomes a survival loop. That's why you'll hear the word talks more often during winter pressure, even when the military lines barely move. The battlefield stays messy, but the bargaining space shifts. This is where security guarantees becomes the most loaded phrase in the war. On paper, it sounds like the clean solution: stop the bleeding, lock in safety, move forward. In practice, it's a high-stakes trade where every side wants a different meaning, a different enforcement mechanism, and a different exit door. Ukraine wants guarantees that actually deter the next invasion, not promises that dissolve at the first crisis. Russia wants terms that limit Ukraine's future choices and turn today's pressure into tomorrow's leverage, and the West wants an outcome that ends escalation without rewarding the method that created it. Here's the uncomfortable part: guarantees aren't magic. They're credibility. Credibility comes from commitments that are politically sustainable and militarily meaningful, and those are hard to design when domestic politics are volatile. A guarantee that's too weak invites a repeat, but a guarantee that's too strong can be politically impossible to deliver, so negotiations start orbiting around vague phrases and conditional frameworks, because clear language forces hard votes. And that ambiguity is exactly where Plan B tries to live, inside the gap between what's promised and what will actually be enforced. Just think about this. If a deal requires Ukraine to concede something permanent while the guarantee remains abstract, who is taking the real risk? That's the core asymmetry that makes trade territory. For safety, such a political minefield. Even if the military logic sounds neat, the lived experience of invasion makes trust brutally expensive. I'm not saying talks are meaningless. I'm saying the structure of the deal matters more than the headline announcing it. Because in wars like this, the first agreement that sounds reasonable is often the one that bakes in the next crisis. Now, I can already hear the counter-argument, and it's not wrong to raise it. People will say Russia doesn't need a dramatic breakpoint, only gradual degradation until Ukraine's economy and society can't keep up. They'll argue that endurance cuts both ways, and that the attacker can keep grinding as long as the defender depends on external support. That's a serious point, and it's exactly why production and logistics matter more than viral clips. But it still runs into the same problem. Gradual degradation must eventually translate into a political decision, not just a permanent emergency. So what does silent failure actually look like in real time? It looks like pain that doesn't convert, escalation that reveals dependence, adaptation that blunts shock, and negotiations that stall because the real issue, credible security, cannot be solved with wordsmithing. It looks like a strategy that terrifies the audience but disappoints the strategist. And it looks like a war slowly changing shape from break them this winter into outproduce them for years. That pivot is the one most viewers miss because it doesn't explode on camera. In the next part, I'm going to lay out 3 pathways this can take and a simple watch list that tells you which one we're sliding into, because the scariest scenario isn't the next blackout, it is the moment both sides stop expecting a breakpoint at all and start building for a production war that has no clean ending. By now, you can feel what Plan B is really trying to do. It's not chasing a battlefield victory, it's chasing a psychological deadline. The moment the public starts asking, how long can this go on, is the moment the strategy thinks it's winning. Yet the latest waves show the same pattern: wide outages, civilian injuries, frantic repairs, and then no political snap. Even when a city loses power in brutal cold, the state doesn't unravel the way this playbook requires. I'm watching a strategy that creates headlines on schedule, but can't produce surrender on schedule. There's a reason the Odesa and Kharkiv moments matter beyond the human tragedy. They lay the perfect case studies for the breakpoint theory: drones hitting homes and energy infrastructure, dozens of people hurt including children, and a major city losing electricity on a freezing night. Plan B is built for exactly this kind of pressure stack: pain plus cold plus uncertainty, and still the response is not collapse. It's adaptation, anger, and faster repair loops. That's the first big reveal in the final act. The suffering is massive, but the conversion rate into political submission is low. Pain is not a lever by itself, it's only a lever if it moves decisions. So the war quietly shifts into something else. When the breakpoint doesn't appear, both sides start building for a longer shape of conflict, where output becomes strategy. Russia leans harder on drone volume because volume keeps the pressure constant. Ukraine responds by scaling interceptors, building counter-drones, and pushing long-range strikes to make Russia pay for the tempo. The headlines call it drone warfare, but I'm telling you it's industrial warfare wearing a drone mask. Try to think about this. In a production race, a single clever weapon matters less than the ability to replace losses every week without blinking. That is the kind of contest that doesn't end with one dramatic scene, it ends with slow advantages compounding. Now let's talk negotiations, because this is where Plan B tries to cash in. Winter pressure doesn't just damage infrastructure. It changes the political atmosphere in which reasonable compromises get defined. You start hearing about faster diplomacy, about urgency, about getting to talks as if time itself is a moral argument. But the table is not neutral ground, it's another battlefield shaped by who can sustain pressure longest. Reports suggest Washington is tying the idea of security guarantees to a deal, and that deal may involve territorial concessions in the Donbas. That isn't a side plot. That is the second big reveal. When a breakpoint can't be forced in the streets, it's attempted in the language of agreements. Here's why that's dangerous. Security guarantees can sound like a clean swap, stability for sacrifice, but guarantees have to be real, enforceable, and politically survivable for the guarantors. If they're vague, they invite a repeat war. If they're strong, they can be hard to pass at home. Russia knows that, and Ukraine knows that, which is why the bargaining space is a minefield of ambiguity. The trap is not the word peace, it's the gap between what is promised and what can actually be delivered when the next crisis hits. I've seen too many wars where the most expensive line is the one that says guarantee without specifying the mechanism, and once the mechanism is unclear, every side hears what it wants to hear. Let me slow the pace for a breath, because this next part is the hinge. Imagine living through weeks of alerts, repairs, cold rooms, and a constant sense that normal life is a rumor. In that environment, people don't only ask, "Can we win?" They ask, "Can we live?" That's where pressure campaigns do their deepest damage, not by destroying a transformer, but by draining the future out of people's thinking. This doesn't mean Ukraine will break. It means the psychological battlefield is real, and it's being fought inside kitchens and stairwells. And it is exactly why we have to be careful with clean narratives about collapse is inevitable. Alright, now speed back up, because the next phase is already visible. I see 3 pathways from here, and none of them are comfortable. First, Russia keeps escalating winter strikes and tries to turn them into a political season each. Outage framed as proof that endurance is impossible. Second, strike and talk becomes the rhythm. Pressure from drones, pressure from diplomacy, pressure from allies being asked to hold the line indefinitely. Third, the war fully mutates into a production grind where both sides accept that there may never be a single breakpoint, only a long contest of supply, repair, and manufacturing. That third pathway is the quiet horror, because it makes years feel realistic, not rhetorical. So how do you tell which path we're sliding into without relying on vibes? Watch the tempo, not the claims. If the drone waves become more frequent and the outages last longer each time, Russia is doubling down on the winter lever. If you start hearing more talk about guarantees tied to specific territorial formulas, the table is becoming the main arena. If both sides start speaking openly in the language of output, production targets, interceptor stockpiles, replacement cycles, then you're watching the birth of a pure attrition industrial war. Try to think about this. The biggest signal isn't what leaders say in speeches, it's what budgets and factories say without speaking. Wars confess their future through logistics. Here's one more grounded habit that helps you read this responsibly. When you see a dramatic strike report, look for 3 follow-ups: how fast power is restored, whether the strike pattern is changing, and whether diplomatic positions harden or soften afterward. That's the real story, because the real battlefield question is not, was there an attack? It's, did the attack move any strategic variable? If it didn't, then it was terror without leverage. And if it did, you'll see it echoed in policy, not just in footage. So where does that leave the claim that Plan B is failing? It is failing in the specific way it promised to win, by forcing a clear breakpoint through winter pressure and Western fatigue. That doesn't mean Russia is harmless. It means the strategy is not producing the strategic outcome at the speed it needs, and when a strategy can't win fast enough, it seeks to redefine winning, either by turning negotiations into a substitute breakpoint or by settling into a longer production contest where it hopes time itself becomes the weapon. The final reveal is this: Plan B may not be a path to victory, but it can still be a path to prolongation, and prolongation is its own kind of violence. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this line: endurance is not just courage, it's systems. Systems that repair faster, intercept smarter, produce more, and keep alliances politically stable under stress. That's why this isn't only a Ukraine story. It is a test of whether modern democracies can sustain long commitments without turning every winter into a referendum. I don't need you to agree with me, I need you to see the mechanism clearly. And that clarity is exactly what pressure campaigns try to steal. So tell me in the comments, one word only, arrives or no. If you want more breakdowns that follow the incentives and the machinery instead of the slogans, you already know what to do. Subscribe and let the algorithm know this is worth pushing.